In this lesson, we're going to introduce our plants unit and try and set the stage for what's to come next. We're going to describe the major groups of plants and their key adaptations, outline the elements that plants need and their sources, and provide an overview of the function of photosynthesis. And by doing those things, I hope to place the plants unit in context and help make more sense of what comes next. First, let's start with the evolutionary relationship among plants. This is an evolutionary family tree with time going in this direction. So up at the top here we have plants that exist today, and down here we have their evolutionary ancestors. Land plants evolved from algae, which are simple and often unicellular photosynthetic organisms that live in water. They're aquatic. And when plants first colonized land, the first division we see has to do with the development of vessels. So these plants over here, which we'll call bryophytes, don't have vessels. And that includes things like mosses. And because they don't have vessels to transport water and nutrients back and forth, they have to be low to the ground and they have to exist in relatively moist areas. However, this line over here indicates the development of a trait. The plants that diverged and went this way all developed vessels. And again, those allow water and nutrients to travel up and down in the plant. And that allows the plants to grow down into the soil looking for water and nutrients and up into the air looking for light. And so the development of vessels opens up new areas that plants can survive in. The next important development that we're going to look at here is the development of seeds. So some plants did not develop seeds, they're indicated over here, and so they don't have seeds, but they do have vessels, so we would call these seedless vascular plants. And seedless vascular plants include things like ferns. Now, ferns don't have seeds, they have spores, and spores are single-celled, and they're actually haploid, and they're part of the life cycle of the plant. In contrast, seeds are complete embryos. They're not single cells, they're complete embryos, and they also contain food stores to help that embryo get going at first, and they're in a protective coat. So that provides many advantages over spores. They can lie dormant for a long time, so they can rest and wait for conditions to be right, for example, for there to be enough moisture, and then that embryo can start growing and consuming the food stores. They can also survive in relatively dry environments, again, waiting until the conditions are right. So seeds are another key adaptation. So all of these plants now have seeds. The last thing that we'll look at is the development of flowers, and flowers have their seeds in an ovary, and that ovary, when it is ripe, develops into the fruit, which might be, for example, carried elsewhere by an animal that eats it, and the seeds deposited somewhere else. So the plants that have flowers are called angiosperms, and those include most of the plants that you might think of, crop plants, etc. And these plants over here that don't have flowers are called gymnosperms, and that literally means naked seed because they don't have their seeds encased in an ovary that then becomes a fruit. And these include plants like conifers, like pine and spruce. So that's a look at the relationship between these groups of plants and how the development of these different adaptations allowed plants to expand into different environments. Over the next few lessons, we're going to look at each of these adaptations in turn. Next, let's look at what plants need in order to survive. Plants need raw materials and energy. Now, the key difference between plants and animals is that plants are autotrophs. They can create their own food using inorganic materials and the energy from light. And so plants, unlike animals, don't have to eat other plants or animals to get their nutrition. Now, it was once thought that plants got their mass from eating soil effectively, that the mass that a plant gained would be observed as lost mass in soil. And so to investigate this, in the 1600s, a Dutch scientist by the name of Van Helmont took a plant and put it in a pot, measured the mass of the plant and the soil, and then added nothing but water to that plant for several years. And then at the end of that, at which point, of course, the plant had grown in mass very considerably, he measured the mass of the grown plant and of the soil. And he saw, of course, that the mass of the plant had gone up a lot, but the mass of the soil was very similar to at the start. It had only decreased very slightly. And so the mass of the plant couldn't be coming from the soil. And Van Helmont's conclusion was that it must be coming from the water. Now, it turns out that that's wrong. It's not coming from the water predominantly. It's actually coming from the air, the carbon dioxide in the air. But this was a very important experiment in the history of botany that showed that the mass gain is not coming primarily from the soil. Now, what are the raw materials that plants need? Well, organic compounds have lots of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and the carbon and the oxygen are coming from carbon dioxide in the air. Hydrogen is coming from water. Amino acids in polypeptides and the nitrogenous bases in nucleic acids have nitrogen, and nitrogen is coming from the soil, getting dissolved in water and entering the plant. And phosphorus, like in ATP or in the sugar phosphate backbone of nucleic acids, that's also coming from the soil, getting dissolved and entering the plant. But most of the mass of the plant is coming from carbon dioxide in air, and it's being made into the molecules that the plant needs through photosynthesis. And I should mention that there are other elements like potassium, for example, that plants need that they also get from the soil. They dissolve in the water in the soil and then move into the plant. Now, the equation summarizing photosynthesis is here. We see that we take carbon dioxide in the air and water from the soil and combine those to make glucose. This is glucose over here. And glucose is a larger, higher energy molecule than carbon dioxide, and so this is an anabolic reaction that requires an input of energy, and that energy comes from light. So plants use light energy to build glucose from carbon dioxide, and that also produces a waste product of oxygen. Now, glucose acts as a storage spot for energy because the glucose can be broken down in a catabolic reaction in cellular respiration and release that energy. So it acts as a storage of energy like a battery. And we've also seen that glucose, when linked together, can make structural polymers like cellulose, cellulose being the major component of plant cell walls. And so glucose is also a raw building material as well. So glucose, for both of those purposes, is made in photosynthesis. Also, we've seen the input of light energy here. Let's just talk about the energy for a moment. That light energy is being converted into chemical potential energy in the bonds of the glucose. And again, that chemical potential energy can be released in cellular respiration when the glucose is broken down. And it's this ability to convert light energy to chemical potential energy that sets plants apart, makes them different from animals and special in that they don't need to eat in order to get their energy. They can get it from light. So that's an overview of how plants get the materials and energy that they need to survive, as well as some of the key adaptations in plants that we'll look at in more detail in future lessons.